You're looking at a riverbed that hasn't had water running through it in months. The ground is cracked, the sand is pale and dry, and if you didn't know any better, you'd walk right past it and keep searching. But the Hadza wouldn't. They'd stop right here, pull out a simple digging stick, and find water within a few feet of the surface. No equipment, no technology, no well. This video is about exactly how they do that. And I want to be upfront. The method sounds almost too simple when you first hear it, which is probably why most people dismiss it. There's this general assumption that finding water in the wild requires either expensive gear, some kind of dowsing rod mysticism, or just dumb luck. But the Hadza have been doing this for tens of thousands of years in one of the harshest, driest environments on Earth, the semi-arid savanna of northern Tanzania, and they do it consistently, reliably, and for free. So what they've figured out is actually rooted in how water moves underground, and once you understand the logic behind it, you'll never look at a dry riverbed the same way again. We're going to walk through the full method: where to look, what to look for on the surface, how to read the landscape like the Hadza do, and then how to actually dig so you're not wasting energy in the wrong spot. And I'll also get into why this works, because the science behind it is genuinely interesting and it'll help you apply this in places you've never been before. So let's start with the thing that most people get wrong, which is where they look for water in the first place. When most people think about finding water in a dry landscape, they think about springs, they think about following animals, they think about collecting dew, and those aren't bad instincts. But the Hadza's most reliable method, the one they use when everything else is uncertain, is subsurface water in dry riverbeds, and specifically in the outer bends of those riverbeds. That's the first key thing to understand, and it changes everything about how you approach this. Here's why the outer bend matters. When a river flows, it doesn't move in a straight line. It curves, and as it curves, the faster moving water on the outside of the bend cuts deeper into the bank and the bed. It also deposits more sediment on the inside of the bend, but on the outside you get coarser material, gravel, sand, broken rock, because the heavier particles settle there when the water slows down after carving through. And coarse material is exactly what you want when you're looking for subsurface water, because it holds moisture longer, and it allows water to percolate down and sit in what's basically a natural underground pocket. So when the river dries up on the surface, which in Tanzania can happen for months at a time, the water doesn't just disappear, it sinks. It moves down through that coarse sediment and it sits in the substrate below, sometimes just a foot or two beneath the surface, sometimes 3 or 4 feet down, held in place by a layer of clay or compacted earth underneath that won't let it drain any further. The Hadza know this. They've known it for so long it's just part of how they see the landscape. But knowing that water is theoretically down there isn't enough. You need to know exactly where to dig, because if you're off by even 10 or 15 feet in the wrong direction, you might hit dry sand all the way down and waste hours of energy you can't afford to waste in a survival situation. So the Hadza use a set of surface signals to narrow it down, and this is where it gets really practical. The first thing they look for is vegetation. Not just any vegetation, specific plants that are known to send roots deep in search of moisture. In East Africa, the big ones are fig trees, certain acacias, and a plant called Salvadora persica, which is also called the toothbrush tree. If you see a cluster of these plants growing in or right next to a dry riverbed, especially on or near an outer bend, that's a strong signal that there's water within reach of their roots. The Hadza don't just notice these plants, they use them as a map. The denser and healthier the plant looks compared to everything around it, the more confident they are that water is close. Now that's important on its own, but if you don't also know how to read the color and texture of the sand, you can still end up digging in the wrong spot. Because the plants tell you water is somewhere nearby, but the surface of the sand tells you where the water is closest to the top. Dry sand that has had recent subsurface moisture tends to look slightly darker than the surrounding area, even when the surface itself is dry to the touch. It's subtle, but it's there. The Hadza also look for sand that has a slightly denser, more compacted appearance, not crusted over the way clay gets, but just a little firmer underfoot. If you press your heel into it and it feels marginally less loose than the sand a few feet away, that's a sign. And in the morning, before the sun has had a chance to heat everything up, you'll sometimes see a faint dampness right at the surface in these spots. Not wet, just not completely bone dry either. The other surface signal is animal tracks. This sounds obvious, but the Hadza are looking at something more specific than just animals come here to drink. They're looking at where the tracks converge. If you see tracks from multiple different species, birds, small mammals, ungulates, all funneling toward one particular section of a dry riverbed, that convergence point is often directly above the shallowest subsurface water. Animals can smell it, they'll scratch at the surface with their hooves or paws. Sometimes you'll find a shallow depression where something has already started digging, That's basically a free GPS coordinate. So you've got your outer bend, you've got your deep-rooted vegetation, you've got the slightly darker compacted sand, and you've got the animal track convergence. When 2 or 3 of those signals overlap in the same spot, the Hadza dig there, not somewhere nearby, right there. And the digging itself is a skill, because you're not just stabbing at the ground randomly. The technique matters a lot, especially if you're doing this by hand or with a basic tool like a stick or a flat rock. You start with a hole about the width of your shoulders, wide enough that you can work in it comfortably, but not so wide that you're moving more earth than you need to. You dig straight down, not at an angle, and you go slowly in the first foot or two, pausing every 6 inches or so to press your palm flat against the bottom of the hole and feel for moisture. You're not looking for it to be wet. You're looking for it to feel cool and slightly dense compared to the surface sand. That temperature difference is a real indicator. Subsurface water keeps the sand around it cooler than the surrounding dry earth, and your hand is sensitive enough to feel that if you pay attention, as you get deeper, maybe 2 to 3 feet down, you start watching for the sand to change color. Wet sand is noticeably darker, almost gray compared to the pale tan of dry sand, and when you start seeing that color shift in the walls of your hole, you slow down even more. You're close. At this point, you don't want to dig aggressively, because if you break through into the water pocket too hard, you'll churn up the sediment and make the water cloudy and difficult to collect. You ease into it. When water starts seeping into the bottom of the hole, you stop digging and you wait. The Hadza will often line the inside of the hole with bark or broad leaves at this point to help filter the water as it seeps in and keep the walls from collapsing and muddying everything. Then they wait, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes longer, for the hole to fill to a drinkable level. They drink directly from it, or they use a hollow reed to sip from it like a straw, which also works as a basic filter through the sand at the bottom. The whole process, from picking the spot to having drinkable water, can take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour depending on the depth and how fast the water seeps in. And they can do this repeatedly at the same location. The hole will refill between uses as long as the subsurface water table is still there. Now here's the part that I think is genuinely underappreciated, and it's why this method is so much more powerful than it first appears. The Hadza aren't just finding water. They're finding water in a landscape that most outside observers would look at and call completely waterless. Researchers and explorers who have traveled through this region have documented being near death from dehydration while walking past riverbeds that the Hadza would have immediately identified as viable water sources. The knowledge gap is that significant, and the reason the knowledge gap exists is that we've been trained to look for water on the surface: running water, standing water, visible moisture. But in arid environments, the surface is almost always a lie. The real water is underground, and the landscape is giving you constant signals about where it is. You just have to know the language. This is actually consistent with how a lot of indigenous water-finding knowledge works around the world. The San people of the Kalahari use a similar method, digging in dry riverbeds and using specific plants as markers. Aboriginal Australians in the desert look for certain trees, particularly river red gums, as indicators of subsurface water. The Tuareg in the Sahara red dune formations and valley shapes to identify where water accumulates underground after rain events that might have happened weeks or months ago. All of these cultures developed the same core insight independently. The surface tells you where the water used to be, and the geology tells you where it went. What the Hadza add to this, and what makes their method particularly refined, is the layering of signals. They're not relying on any single indicator. They're reading the terrain, the plants, the animal behavior, and the surface texture all at once, and they're cross-referencing all of it before they commit to digging. That's what makes them so consistently successful in a place where most people would fail. Before we keep going, I want to say, if this kind of deep dive into how people actually survive and thrive in extreme environments is something you find yourself watching more of, it's worth subscribing. There's a lot more content here on traditional knowledge and wilderness skills that doesn't get covered anywhere near enough. And the algorithm basically decides whether to show it to more people based on whether folks like you are sticking around and engaging. So if this is your kind of thing, a subscribe genuinely helps. And if you've got thoughts on the Hadza or other groups who do this kind of thing, drop it in the comments. Those conversations are always worth having. Now, the other piece of this that I haven't talked about yet is what to do when the signals are ambiguous. Because sometimes you'll be in a dry riverbed and you'll see some of the indicators but not all of them, or they'll be pointing to slightly different spots, and you need a way to make a decision. The Hadza's approach in that situation is to prioritize the vegetation signal over everything else, and specifically to look at the root exposure at the base of the plant. If the soil has eroded slightly around the base of a fig tree or an acacia and you can see the upper roots, look at how those roots are oriented. Roots follow moisture. If the lateral roots near the surface are growing predominantly in one direction, angling toward a specific part of the riverbed, that's the direction the water is. It sounds almost too simple, but roots don't lie. They grow toward what they need, and if you can see which way they're heading, you can follow them. The other tiebreaker the Hadza use is time of day. In the early morning, before the heat of the day drives moisture deeper into the ground, the surface signals are strongest. The slight darkening of moist sand is most visible in morning light. The smell of damp earth, which is actually a real thing you can train yourself to detect, is strongest in the early morning when the air is cool and less volatile. If you're trying to read ambiguous signals, do it at dawn, not at midday. And there's one more thing worth knowing about the digging location that most guides on this topic completely skip over, which is the relationship between the hole location and the direction of flow in the original river. When you're digging in an outer bend, you want to position your hole slightly upstream of the apex of the bend, meaning slightly toward where the water was coming from, not where it was going. The reason is that sediment deposition patterns mean the coarsest, most water-retentive material tends to accumulate just upstream of the sharpest point of the curve. Downstream of the apex, the material gets finer and more compacted, which means less water storage. It's a small adjustment, but in a dry environment, small adjustments are the difference between finding water and not finding it. So to put the whole method together, you find a dry riverbed, you walk it looking for outer bends, and at each outer bend you check for deep-rooted vegetation, slightly darker or denser sand, and animal track convergence. When you find a spot where multiple signals overlap, you position your hole slightly upstream of the sharpest point of the bend. You dig straight down. You feel for temperature changes and watch for color shifts in the sand, and you ease into the water pocket slowly when you get close. Then you wait for the hole to fill, and you drink. That's it. No equipment, no technology, no cost. Just knowledge and patience, and the ability to read a landscape. And I think the reason this is so worth knowing, even if you never find yourself in a survival situation in Tanzania, is that it fundamentally changes how you see dry landscapes. Once you understand that a dry riverbed is actually a potential water source, you start noticing things you would have walked past before. You start reading terrain differently. You start understanding that what looks barren often isn't, and that the people who've lived in these places for thousands of years figured that out a long time ago. The Hadza have never needed to dig a permanent well because they've never needed to. The landscape already has what they need. They just learn to read it. There's something worth sitting with in that. We tend to think of technological solutions as the advanced ones: drilling rigs, water purification systems, infrastructure. And those things matter enormously. But there's a different kind of sophistication in knowing a place so well that you can find water in a landscape that looks completely empty, using nothing but observation and accumulated knowledge passed down across generations. That's not primitive. That's a level of environmental literacy that most of us have completely lost. If you want to go deeper on this, there's a video on this channel about how the San people of the Kalahari find water in the desert using methods that are similarly overlooked. It covers some different techniques that complement what the Hadza do, and together they give you a much more complete picture of how humans have solved the water problem in extreme environments without modern tools. I'll link it at the end, and it's worth watching back to back with this one. To bring it all together, the Hadza find water in dry riverbeds by reading a set of layered surface signals: the outer bend of the riverbed, deep-rooted vegetation like fig trees and acacias, slightly darker and denser sand, and the convergence of animal tracks. They dig slightly upstream of the sharpest point of the bend. They go slowly. They feel for temperature changes. They watch for color shifts, and they ease into the water pocket when they get close. The whole thing is free. It requires no gear, and it works because of real geology. Water sinks into coarse sediment in riverbed bends and sits above clay layers underground, long after the surface has dried out completely. What changed from the beginning of this video is that a dry riverbed is no longer just a dry riverbed. It's a map, and now you know how to read it.